Hello everybody and welcome to Drydock episode 120. This week's questions are taken from Guide 185, that's the guide to the 1047 class battlecruisers of the Royal Dutch Navy that were never actually completed, and the video on Western Approaches Command, fighting U-boats with Wrens. So let's get stuck into these questions. SciY asks, you mentioned that the Scharnhorst class made an impression. Would you mind going over in some more detail what the impact of the reveal of the Scharnhorst class had? The Scharnhorst class made quite a significant impression at the time that they were announced, if you like. Bearing in mind that this was just after the Germans had concluded the Anglo-German naval agreement, so the people who were most worried about the German Navy had, up until that point, had to only really consider things like the Deutschland class. And while the Deutschland class 1-on-1 would be a match for any of the 8-inch heavy cruisers then in service, they could be hunted down and killed by small cruiser groups, or as the French had done, by building something like Dunkirk or Strasbourg. The larger navies either had sufficient heavy cruisers to deal with the problem, or so they thought, or in the case of the British, they had battle cruisers. But when the Scharnhorst debuted, it did throw a little bit of a spanner into the works. Now, at the time, everyone was already gearing up to build what would turn out to be the final generation of treaty battleships anyway. So, for the larger navies, in and of themselves, the existence of the Scharnhorst was not a massive issue, because something like a King George V or a North Carolina would be quite comfortably able to take one on. However, for the French, it meant that something like Dunkirk or Strasbourg was no longer enough to deal with the Scharnhorst. They up-armoured Strasbourg a little bit, but in a lot of ways the deployment of the Scharnhorsts did kind of force their hand a little bit with the design and development of Richelieu, other issues obviously existing as well. Because the other factor was that in terms of capital ships, practically everyone had World War I era ships, and a few navies had immediately post-World War I era ships. And again, something like in Germany, the Deutschland class wouldn't be much of a problem for an old-school capital ship. Granted, the Deutschland class could outrun any of the World War I era non-battle cruiser ships, but that was less of a concern from the fact that, obviously designed as merchant raiders, well, you could put an R-class or a Britannia class or any of the standard class, and there was absolutely no way that a Deutschland could stand up to those. But, especially when you're looking at the French, when the Scharnhorst come out, bearing in mind that whilst, yes, they have 9 11-inch versus 6 11-inch on the Deutschlands, which would suggest on paper only a 50% increase in firepower, they are bigger, they're faster, they're much better protected, and those 11-inch guns are considerably more powerful than those on the Deutschlands. So all of a sudden, an old, relatively unmodernized capital ship like a Britannia could be in danger of actually losing a straight-up fight to a Scharnhorst. And so that changes the naval paradigm quite a bit. And obviously Germany's building two. It's reasonable that they would operate the two together, as indeed historically they did for a good while, at which point quite a number of older capital ships start to look a little bit vulnerable. And so for some of the medium-sized navies, this was actually a fairly major issue to consider, especially, as I said, for the French Navy. But even in the larger navies, if you look at the design specs that were being looked at for the North Carolina, King George V, and even to a certain extent with the Italians for the Littorios, there were a number of options, some of which were faster than others. Now everyone kind of settles in, apart from the Italians who cheat, but the actual proper treaty designs settle in at around a 28 knot top speed. But there were designs that were more heavily armoured, but slightly slower. And it's fair to say that the presence of the Scharnhorst, whilst they weren't enough to prompt those navies to actually up their speed of their capital ships to 30 knots immediately or more, it did kind of prompt them to stick more with the 28 knot speed, because a 2 knot speed difference, okay, the treaty capital ship is slightly slower, but it would mean that the Scharnhorst would be limited to engaging or running away. They wouldn't have enough of a speed advantage to start manoeuvring around them. So the summary would effectively be they had a great impression, but that impression in terms of forcing navies into action was more exacerbated in the small to medium-sized navies, who now had to come up with a specific counter to it, and less so the larger navies, who did have pre-existing counters, but it did to a small degree influence those larger navies' design choices to ensure that future ships would indeed continue to be a counter. And of course, it also prompted some theories about supercruiser designs to a certain extent as well, although the supercruiser stuff was more related to the outgrowth of treaty cruisers and people cheating on that part of the treaty. Josh Thomas Moore asks, the Royal Navy is making a new class of 10 new destroyers and 5 carriers. What would you name the classes and the ships? Now, with the carriers, it's a bit of an interesting one, because with Queen Elizabeth and Prince of Wales, the Royal Navy have obviously pivoted to naming carriers in the vein of pre-existing capital ships, which makes a certain amount of sense, as opposed to the older tradition of carrier names they specifically had earlier with things like Ark Royal. I personally would like to see another Ark Royal, so that would be one down, for sure. And to be perfectly honest, HMS Eagle has had enough carriers named after. I think Eagle should be continued. I'd also probably go with Implacable, because that's a pretty good name and has a carrier backstory. But if we do want to include some nod to the fact that we're now using capital ship names, then I think maybe use Temeraire. It was sadly obviously lost when the Lion class were cancelled, so yeah, Temeraire would be a good carrier name. And we might as well go with Formidable as well, because Formidable has been the name of quite a few Royal Navy capital ships, as well as obviously a carrier. So those would be my picks for the carriers. As far as the destroyers go, well, given that we've seemed to have reverted back to letter-based naming, then that would make the next destroyer class the E class. And so picking from Royal Navy ships that have had their names begin with the letter E, my pick for the top 10 names for an E-class destroyer flotilla would be Emerald, Enterprise, Eclipse, Electra, Endymion, Escort, of course, Euryalus, Excalibur, Express, and Errant. IO2 asks a number of questions about the Dutch Navy, namely, if the Dutch had identified the need for a 1047 type ship in 1932 instead of 1938, what would the resulting ship likely look like and why? And what made the twin 40mm Hazemeyer mount so good? So if the Dutch had looked for a 1047 style ship back in the early 30s, I think you might have seen something that's actually a little bit less capable than the final 1047 design. For similar reasons, actually, for the impact of the Scharnhorst class. Back at the beginning of the 30s, if you were looking around for fast ships that would act as a deterrent, you'd be looking at deterring things like heavy cruisers, which ostensibly are still sticking by the treaties. You'd be looking at deterring maybe the Deutschland class, and the Netherlands wasn't really planning on going to war with France, so the Dunkirks probably wouldn't have factored in too much to that equation, but they might have had some influence on what could be possibly done. And of course, if you're thinking the Japanese are going to be a threat, you're also looking at the Congos. So you'd be looking for something that would still need to be fast, because the Congos were fast, the Deutschlands were relatively fast, and you're also mainly looking at heavy cruisers, which are equally fast. So you'd still be looking at something 30 plus knots. In terms of armament, however, the armament of the historical 1047 design would not have been necessary to deal with heavy cruisers strictly, or even the Deutschlands. The 9 guns would have provided an overwhelming fire superiority, true, but that whether or not you could get away with somewhat less than that would probably have been a question that was argued. About the only flip side to that argument is, of course, with the Congos with their 14-inch guns, although they have lighter armour, you'd probably have still needed something of that nature. So I think you probably would have seen something that was about as fast, probably slightly less well armoured. It would be probably more designed to resist 8-inch shell fire and Deutschland's 11-inch guns, and probably just ignored the 14-inch guns of the Congos on the basis that at that point you're creating a much larger vessel, much more heavily protected for effectively a single case use that would therefore either be much more expensive or less effective against heavy cruisers. In terms of weaponry, they might have stuck or gone with the 9-11-inch guns. I have a feeling, though, that with the Dunkirks just about coming into consideration at that point, and the desire for economy as well as speed, you might have actually seen them take inspiration from them instead. So maybe go with 2 quad turrets in an all-forward arrangement, kind of almost like a mini Dunkirk style setup, which gives you only 1 less gun than 3 triples, but because of the compactness of the citadel, etc., it gives you cost savings, and obviously you only have to order 2 sets of turrets per ship. So that might be something along those lines. There's a slightly smaller Dunkirk with 11-inch guns instead of 13 and a bit. As far as the Hazemeyer, whatever you want to call it, mount, I'm sure that someone who speaks Dutch can correct me in the comments, was concerned, the reason it was seen as such as an advance, although it was a little bit of a maintenance hog, was that previously the mounts were generally fixed to the ship. I mean, obviously even the Hazemeyer mount was, but directly. So you could receive your fire control directions, you could even be using your manual systems, be pointing at an aircraft, but if the ship takes a sharp lurch, either from a hit or from some maneuver, or it hits a wave, or just general movement, that's going to be throwing off your aim. So you're going to have, instead of a nice clear stream of fire where you want it to, you're going to kind of be vaguely hosing down the area of sky in that vicinity. The Hazemeyer mount was one of the earliest and pretty much one of the first to actually work stabilized mounts. It could also carry its own fire control system on the mount, which was quite useful, but although it required in the early versions a second set of crew to actually ensure that the stabilization remained straight and level, it meant that regardless of the pitch and roll of the ship that you were on, your gun mount for anti-aircraft work would stay near enough, as makes a difference, dead level, and that meant that you had a much more stable firing platform to engage enemy aircraft. Let's say, instead of having your aim thrown off by the movements of the ship, whilst you still had some to consider, especially the vertical movement, you wouldn't be pitching and being thrown about everywhere, which meant that in turn your engagement of the aircraft, your rounds are going to be much closer to the target much more consistently, which increases the chance of you hitting something and shooting it down. And that's why the mount was copied so extensively in Western navies. Carolus Magnus Rex Francorum et Imperator Romarum, or Romanorum, who has a name almost as long as his question, asks, when reading a book on the 100 Years' War, I was surprised to find a naval engagement on the scale of the Battle of Sluis. Could you cover the maritime operations of the 100 Years' War in more detail someday, including the raids and support of the French to the Scots? So that will probably come in 2 videos. As I mentioned before, I do have plans to do a Battle of Sluis specific Wednesday video. It's just that some of the filming I wanted to do for that, including filming of the remains of an actual genuine ship from that exact time period, have kind of gone by the wayside due to COVID, so we'll have to see how that goes in the future, but I will pick that video up at some point. The other aspect, sort of the general naval operations of the 100 Years' War, that I could definitely do. It sounds like something I would be very interested in doing. However, I think I will have to enlist a specialist in medieval naval warfare and the history of that particular time period to help with that. And I think also that kind of scope probably lends itself to collaboration between YouTubers. I know recently Historiograph, the channel, has we were vaguely discussing in comments about doing a collaboration at some point, so I'm thinking that might actually be a really good one to do. But we'll see how that goes. Martin Horowitz asks, when do we get an HMS Pinafore special? Probably around about the time that I learned to sing. Which I think is listed on the Geneva Convention just below me learning to dance as things that probably warrant whatever the modern version of excommunication from the human race is for the nation that permits it. So you might be waiting a while. Tom Riley asks, at the beginning of the video you discussed the purpose of the 1047s. Why, given their intention to be a risk fleet style of ship, requiring substantial resources from the Japanese Navy to be put at risk, why not build battleships rather than battle cruisers? So there's quite a few reasons. You might think, oh, wouldn't a battleship be more expensive? Well, actually no, for the same armament, a battleship is slower, machinery is quite expensive. Yes, armour is thicker, but it's also physically smaller. So overall, on average, a battleship costs a little bit less than its battlecruiser equivalent. So it certainly wasn't a budgetary consideration. The main thing was effectively force structure within the Japanese Navy. If you make a risk fleet as the Dutch, and your main theory is that you're going to be fighting the Japanese, or at least hopefully deterring the Japanese, if you build 3 battleships, they're going to have to be relatively speedy anyway because the Japanese have the Nagatos. But even assuming you build them at 25, 26 knots, something like that, the Japanese have more battleships than you. Even if you build 3, they can turn up with the Fusos, the Iseis, the Nagatos. Obviously, they're going to be building the Yamatos. No one quite knows what they are at this point, but you know they're going to be building something, plus the Congos. And if you're a battleship, you're not going to be fast enough to get away, which means that in actual fact, the Japanese can relatively easily deal with your risk fleet scenario, because the smaller ships that your battleships could kill can run away from you, and you can't get away from the superior Japanese battle fleet, which can show up and crush you very quickly. If you have battle cruisers, at least obviously in an era before they quite appreciated how dangerous aircraft and aircraft carriers could be, the idea runs that, okay, maybe you don't quite have the armour to stand up to battleships in a full-on fleet engagement, but you don't need to because you have the speed to not be there. Unless you're facing the Congos, and the Congos have relatively thin armour, so you probably stand a fighting chance. It also means that you can chase down and kill enemy cruisers, and you know that the Japanese cruisers are a finite resource, and they really, really want them to be intact to fight the Americans. And as I said, if you're facing off against the Congos, you design a battlecruiser that's a little bit better protected and can punch through the Congos' relatively weak armour. And you've now taken those off the table as something that would be a hard counter to your ships. So that effectively then means that whilst the Nagatos, Fusos, Iseis, and whatever you think the Yamatos are going to turn into are still a danger to you, they're not a danger that can box you in. You can kind of run around them, and whilst in theory the Japanese could escort a invasion convoy with enough battleships that you couldn't pick them off with your 1047s, that would involve committing the majority, if not all, of Japan's heavy capital ship forces, which you know they don't want to do. And meanwhile, your 1047s are equally capable of picking off, either if they're working in pairs, picking off Congos, or working alone, picking off heavy cruisers, which is pretty much the only other thing the Japanese have to send after you, apart from obviously aircraft carriers. And so you basically force the Japanese into a situation where if they want to come after you, they either have to pretty much commit their battle fleet, which they don't want to do, or they have to commit vast amounts of their Congo and cruiser force, which they also don't want to do. And even if they do one of those two things, you can still be running around picking off lone ships, attacking convoys, and generally making a nuisance of yourself well past any reasonable time. Whereas if you go with the battleships, the Japanese can pretty much box you in and not be at risk of losing anything other than maybe one or two ships damaged by just turning up in overwhelming force in a position where you can't get away. Then, was Western Approaches Command ever used by the Royal Observer Corps or any other part of Britain's strategic-civil defence infrastructure during the Cold War? This being obviously from the Western Approaches Command video. Officially, no. But unofficially, as was discussed in the video on Western Approaches Command, when they've been doing renovation works, etc., they have found some evidence that someone was using it. Someone official, that is. So according to the official storyline, Western Approaches Command was stood down at the end of the Second World War, locked up, and that was that as far as governmental use went. However, when they have been doing their renovation work, they have found specifically communiques, documents, etc., from military governmental sources that were in what was left of the bunker, and which date well into the 50s, possibly even into the early 60s. So that would indicate someone had to be there to leave those things behind, and therefore it would seem likely that even if it wasn't being fully actively used, it was at least being used as a backup facility, maybe being kept on ice, or maybe there were some small-scale operations going on there for quite a while after it was officially discontinued. But unless and until those particular documents are declassified, we're never going to know for sure. Zhu Fang asks, will you be covering the events of ONS 5? So this was one of the major convoys whose battle was seen as one of the big turning points in the Battle of the Atlantic. At some point, yes, I will probably cover that in a Wednesday video. I will also at some point cover the Battle of the Atlantic, at least in a high level, in a Wednesday video. But those, again, will probably be two separate videos. As for when, who knows? There's an awful lot on the plate, as it were, to go through. Al T asks, I once read, heard, or saw somewhere the statement that Churchill was more fearful of the Atlantic War than the Battle of Britain, and that England was 2 weeks away from capitulation due to the loss of merchant ships. Is there any truth to that statement? Now, as far as was Britain 2 weeks away from having to drop out of the war, I don't know, but I doubt it. The reason I say I don't know is because various figures are bandied about in numerous sources, both books published these days and evaluations of the period, and they all give wildly different speculative numbers as to how close was Britain to pulling out. Now, as it's certainly true that Britain was on the back foot in the Battle of the Atlantic for a considerable portion of the early part of World War II, and there were concerns that if losses continued at the projected rates, that Britain wouldn't be able to continue an active participating role in the Second World War. However, how close that ran, just doing a quick perusal of some of the books that I've got and some other sources that are available elsewhere, there are statements made of anything from a convoy, which would have been 7 to 14 days away, all the way up to a month, 2 months, 4 months, 6 months, and everything in between, as if losses continue at X rate, this is how long we have till we're out. So which particular one you choose to believe, to be perfectly honest, it's something that, whilst I haven't looked into it in a massive amount of detail, I would say you could consider any number of factors, and whichever ones you use, you will probably arrive at a completely different conclusion to someone who decides to exclude one of the factors you look at, or includes one that you missed, or gives different weight to factors that you both considered. So yeah, I definitely wouldn't put any money down on a specific figure there. As far as Churchill saying he was more scared of the Battle of the Atlantic than the Battle of Britain, that much is true. He did say that. As for whether or not he was correct, I would tend to lean towards him being actually correct. The reason for that, that I say, is not because the Battle of Britain wasn't a vital struggle. It was, and I'd take nothing away from the bravery of the many different pilots who fought there. But if the Battle of the Atlantic was lost, Britain would be short of food, it would be short of military supplies. There was a reason why, whatever figure you want to look at, there was an estimation that if losses continue at a certain rate in the Battle of the Atlantic, we will be out of the war, because we can't feed our people, we can't equip our armed forces, we can't provide them with the fuel if we don't get enough ships in. So the Battle of the Atlantic was one of the very, very few things that could directly, by losing it, have knocked Britain out of the war. If Britain lost the North African campaign, it would be bad. But as long as they didn't then lose the Middle East, the sort of the Arabian area, and they still had a base to come out from, they wouldn't lose the war entirely. They obviously lost, the Allies lost the Battle of France. That didn't knock Britain out, although obviously it did knock France out. The loss of Norway didn't knock Britain out, and so on and so forth. The Battle of the Atlantic could directly have knocked Britain out of the war. And this is why I say the Battle of Britain is less of an immediate direct threat to Britain's existence than the Battle of the Atlantic, because even if Britain had lost the Battle of Britain, which would have been somewhat embarrassing, and completely lost control of the skies to the Luftwaffe, that in and of itself doesn't mean Britain is out of the war. It means Britain is now vulnerable to invasion, or more vulnerable to invasion than it had been in the past. But of course, as we know, the only way for Germany to actually carry that out would be some version of Operation Sea Lion, and that has so many operational issues with it, not least of which obviously includes the fact the Royal Navy would have something to say about that particular invasion, and the defences on land, and any resurgent Royal Air Force. So whilst the Battle of Britain, if lost, could have been a stepping stone on the way to getting Britain knocked out of the war, the next couple of stepping stones, i.e. actually invading to knock Britain out of the war, are still some fairly major hurdles for the Germans to climb, whereas, as I said, the loss of the Battle of the Atlantic, that immediately terminates Britain's involvement in the war without a single German foot having to step onto mainland British soil. Derp Squad asks, did the Western Allies ever run trap convoys, say of armed merchants and more escorts than usual, to bait submarines into attacking what seemed to be a valuable convoy, but was essentially a gigantic sub-hunting group? Not in the manner that you describe. The main reasons for that is, one, merchant ships make awful sub-hunters. And secondly, the Allies really couldn't spare enough merchant ships to form a realistic, juicy-looking merchant convoy that was actually just full of armed vessels of some description. So, yeah, between the lack of available shipping, at least until the end, towards the end of the war, when it really didn't matter, and the fact that merchant ships make really good targets for U-boats, even when they're somewhat armed, yeah, running a full decoy convoy, as it were, not really a thing. They did, however, set bait convoys in a way. The convoy itself would still be carrying valuable material, certainly, but the way that the Allies would manage that was, you would have a beefed up escort, because they knew that the subs were coming after the convoys, and they would also sometimes have free hunting, sub-hunting groups. So you have things like the second escort group, for example, and they would be attached to or in proximity to a convoy. So the idea would be that, let's say the Germans get wind of a particularly rich convoy that's going out. Now, hopefully via Enigma intercepts, the Allies know that the Germans are going after it. So they add 1, 2, 3, 4 more ships to the convoy's escort. This isn't going to tip the Germans' hand, particularly because, hey, it's a really valuable convoy. That's why the Germans are concentrating against it. And so the idea that a really valuable convoy might have a few extra escorts than a normal one is not really that much out of hand or out of the question. So no one is particularly suspicious, although it does make it a particularly hard nut to crack. However, once you've kind of fixed the U-boats in place by the fact that you've either detected their signals or they've begun to attack, so you know that they're now going after the convoy, that's when you bring in these free hunting hunter-killer groups, effectively. And these will be equipped with scouts, sloops, corvettes, and all those kinds of things. But because they're not tied to the convoy, and they don't have to conserve fuel as much because they're not doing an entire transatlantic mission, they're just coming out for what they anticipate to be a specific engagement, they can be much, much more aggressive in their pursuit of submarines, and they can also afford to just keep following them, keep hammering them down. With a convoy escort, if you drive the submarine off and the convoy moves past, then apart from maybe the occasional night run in at the rear, you pretty much can ignore them, and pretty much would have to ignore them, because if your escort ship, let's say it was able to keep chasing the submarine down and it kept running west while your convoy is running east, if it takes you 6, 8, 12 hours to hunt down and finish off that submarine, you're now probably several days behind the convoy. I mean, if the convoy is traveling at 10, 12 knots and your escort can do 16, 18 knots, you're going to be closing at about 5 to 6 knots. And if you're 12 hours away, where you've both been going in opposite directions, with a cumulative parting speed of 30-ish knots, maybe slightly less, is going to take you 2 or 3 days to get back. And during those 2 to 3 days, not only are you more vulnerable because you're on your own, but your convoy is now missing an escort ship. So you couldn't do that. And simply in all directions, you had to stick close to defend the convoy. These hunter-killer groups, if there was a submarine that needed killing, it didn't matter. If it took a day, if it took 2 days, if it took 3 days, they would keep going after it. And so that kind of system was in place with some convoys. Once the Allies had enough escorts available to actually, form these hunter-killer groups in the first place, rather than assign those ships to convoy escorts themselves. And in this way, this was one of the many ways that the U-boat menace started to be overcome, because when you look at a lot of convoy battles, at least in the early part, in the run-up to sort of maybe early 43, you'll see that X number of U-boats were sunk, maybe a relatively small number, a larger number were damaged to a varying degree, and still more were driven off. But if a submarine is damaged, it can either withdraw to port and come back. If a submarine is lightly damaged, it might stay out for a little bit and still can go to port and come back. And if it was just driven away, well, they'll just wait for the next convoy. So all of this not only maintains the numbers of U-boats in the Kriegsmarine, but also means in some cases that other convoys are now at risk. Whereas with these hunter-killer groups, by actually ensuring that the submarine is either killed or very, very badly damaged, or else driven miles and miles and miles and miles and miles away, even if it manages to lose the tail, then it massively diminishes the threat to other Allied convoys, because a submarine that's been chased for hours, if not days, probably isn't going to be in a position to intercept any other convoys anytime soon. And obviously a U-boat, I should say, that is sunk can't threaten anyone, and a U-boat that's very heavily damaged has to limp home and is going to be out of action for quite considerable time. Timothy Sohn asks, Drach, what techniques did the Germans develop to offset the work of the Wrens? The Wrens, of course, serving in the Western Approaches Tactical Unit, were the ones who wargamed out and defeated a lot of the tactics and techniques used by U-boat commanders. So, to offset that work, the Germans tried multiple different approaches. Obviously, German submarine commanders weren't idiots. They would vary their own tactics as much as they could. And this was why the Wrens ended up coming up with multiple different tactics over the months and years of the Battle of the Atlantic, because they would develop a tactic that worked especially well against a specific U-boat attack profile, And once it became clear that actually this is probably a suicidal move on the U-boat's part, the U-boat captains would go back. They'd think of some other way of attacking enemy shipping, and then losses would increase. The Wrens would analyse it. They would go, okay, well, this is probably now what they're doing instead, so this is how we counter this, and so on and so forth. So initially you had a fairly standard, here is a bunch of ships, I will attack it. And as you can see from some of the later techniques the Wrens developed, once that became a bit harder, you would have U-boat captains who would drop past the convoy and then run in from behind at night on the surface when they couldn't be seen, fire torpedoes, drop back, come up again, run in, fire torpedoes, drop back over the course of several nights, because everyone's thinking that there will be submarines ahead of them, not necessarily submarines behind them. When that tactic is adapted to, they have submarines that will sit in front of the convoy and radio the position so that other submarines can kind of vaguely conduct a joint attack or vector in without having to expose themselves. The Wrens obviously then develop a tactic to go and charge those ships down to take them out. Then you have the Germans adapt to that still further, so they're like, okay, well, we know if we have a ship that's or U-boat that's transmitting ahead of the convoy, they'll charge out. So then what they would do is they'd have other U-boats in that vicinity, so when these escorts come and charging out, the U-boats that aren't the one that's transmitting would drift in slowly on low power past the charging line of escorts who, when they're charging, can't really use their sonar or ASDIC systems very well. And then those submarines now have access to a convoy that is badly depleted of escorts. And then the Wrens saw that, and they came up with counter tactics to that. So it was a kind of game of one-upmanship all the way through the era of the Battle of the Atlantic. And of course, certain of these tactics were, on both sides, were predicated by assumptions or known performance parameters of the U-boats themselves. So, for example, a U-boat has to surface every so often to recharge its batteries. A U-boat can't run past a certain speed when it's at underwater, etc., etc. And so the development of the snorkel, the development of the electric boats, etc., all of this was trying to change the tactical paradigm, because if your system of search, patrol, and spotting relies on the U-boats performing in a certain manner, so it's like, okay, we force the submarine down, we know it must come up in X number of hours or days for air and to recharge its batteries, or we know that we force the submarine down here, therefore in the past 2 hours with a maximum underwater speed of so many knots, it could only have gone so far, so it's within this area and therefore we're safe because we've bypassed that area. If you've got boats that can travel faster underwater, boats that can stay longer underwater, boats that can use a snorkel so they're less obvious if they do, when they do have to recharge their batteries, all of this changes those assumptions, which in turn opens up new tactical avenues which have to then be countered. And of course, the other assumption is once a torpedo is fired, it's going to run in a straight line, or very shortly thereafter it's going to run in a straight line if it's going to correct off on a certain course. That enables you to dodge, it enables you to think about, okay, well, if we know the U-boat's in this area, then if we're at this angle to it or in this position, it's going to be very difficult for them to get the appropriate shot. But then, of course, the Germans develop zigzagging torpedoes, they develop acoustic homing torpedoes. Again, it changes up the tactical paradigm. So there was an awful lot of work going on in the Kriegsmarine to deal with the counter-tactics of the Allied escorts, which were very often driven by data put through by the Wrens in the Watu unit. But eventually, it turns out the Wrens won. Kind of helped by considerable amounts of explosive loaded onto various British and other Canadian, Australian, American, etc. escort vessels. But without that tactical underpinning that the Wrens developed, the lessons that individual brilliant commanders out on the in the Battle of the Atlantic came up with wouldn't have been able to have been disseminated and strengthened across the escort force. Dennis Kocher asks, what can you tell us about the SS President Harrison, the cargo vessel that was supposed to deliver Peking Man in December of 1941? So this particular President Harrison, which is not the same as the Liberty ship SS President Harrison, which was named for the ship afterwards, after the events that we're going to look at now. So she was built in 1920 as a liner, after going through several owners, including the wonderfully named Dollar Steamship Lines. Not necessarily sure I'd want to sail with them. But anyway, she was named to SS President Harrison, having previously been Wolverine State, previously Drachin. And when she was taken into ownership of the American President Line, which was a passenger line service at the time, ironically enough, she was sold to the President Line pretty much at the time that her involvement with the Peking Man situation comes into play, at the end of 1940. So she spends about a year in service as SS President Harrison, and then along with her sister ship SS President Madison, she embarks the 4th US Marines from China. Unfortunately, this happens at the end of 1941, and she's told to go back and pick up the last remaining Marines of the diplomatic guards, as well as a bunch of equipment, and bring it all back to the Philippines, because, well, they think they're going to need it, which they're right, they will. However, she leaves port on this mission, leaving from China, the day after Pearl Harbor's been attacked. So she ends up being chased by Japanese aircraft and by basically is a Japanese auxiliary cruiser, and her captain runs her aground in order to ensure that, well, the crew will survive because they're not sinking at sea, but also that the ship can't be of any use to the Japanese. Then a Japanese destroyer shows up, orders the crew back on board because obviously they'd abandoned ship, and they're pretty much left there for about half a year or so whilst the Japanese make efforts to salvage the ship, which they eventually manage to do. The ship's taken back to China, to a Japanese-controlled area, and the crew are kicked off. The ship is repaired and renamed again to the Kako Maru, and then shortly thereafter to the Kachidoki Maru, and given over to Japanese interests, who then use her as a cargo and transportation ship during much of World War II. So this is actually where she spends the majority of her active career in the conflict. She's running all over the place in various convoys for the Japanese Navy, and surprisingly enough, lasts pretty much until the last year of the war. And then in September 1944, as part of a convoy, she comes under attack from a number of US submarines, the USS Growler, the USS Sea Lion, etc. And despite the best efforts of her new crew, she is hit by torpedoes fired by the USS Pampanito, SS-383, and then ends up sinking. She's at that point carrying passengers. She's not running as a cargo transport per se, and a majority of them are rescued, and the ship goes down, which does spark a bit of a controversy ever since, because, as you mentioned, Peking Man, ancient fossils, which were supposed to have been put aboard the ship in US Marine footlockers, and there's then a sort of something of an eternal debate of, were these footlockers removed from the ship? Were the contents removed from the ship? Were they just left in place? If they were left in place, does that mean the fossils are at the bottom of the ocean in the wreck of the ship, or are they taken off? Have they been taken off elsewhere? Where have they ended up? Who knows? Grant M. Vitsnick, I think, asks, in your recent 5-minute guide on the Queen Mary, you mentioned that the layout of the crew and officer quarters had been reverted back to officers in the rear and crew amidships and forward, whilst the reverse had been tried on the Lion class with mixed success. What were the reasons for the rearrangement of the Lion class, and why did this layout not seem to work out? Was there a practical reason, such as the crew needing to be further forward to reach action stations, or was it tradition and protocol? There were a number of different reasons behind it. traditionally, when you go all the way back to the Age of Sail, officers' accommodations had always been in the stern because, apart from anything, it was the most comfortable part of the ship. So, shockingly enough, they decided that this is where they were going to live. This had become somewhat less popular with the advent of steamships because all of a sudden, instead of being a very nice, comfortable area to live, you were suddenly positioned right above the propellers and the propeller shafts, which, especially in earlier steamships, was, shall we say, not necessarily the world's quietest environment. Also, as ships' sterns started to become more and more elongated and more pointed to deal with the fact that they were now steam-propelled vessels instead of the rather sort of rather flat, almost not transom sterns, but you could be forgiven for thinking so if you looked at the back of an average Age of Sail ship that was particularly heavily laden down. It meant the actual space available in the absolute stern of the vessel was also reduced. So tradition had kind of kept things there anyway for a long period, but one of the experiments with the Lion class was to try and concentrate all of the officers' accommodation, their wardroom, entertainment, etc., all pretty much around about the bridge superstructure, on the theory that, well, it would be warmer and more comfortable and less noisy, albeit turbines had made the noise issue somewhat less acute. And it would mean that the officers obviously were right next to the access to the bridge, so all would be well and good. However, it did lead to a couple of issues, one of which was, and I know it sounds silly, but the crew kept looking into the officers' wardroom to see what was going on, which the officers found very disconcerting. But also, it actually meant there was a loss of operational efficiency on the ship because most of the assignments that the crew had were amidships or slightly forward. Once you got aft of the rearmost gun turret, there wasn't a tremendous amount to actually do back there. The engines were further forward. It was mostly stores and stuff. Even the secondary battery was forward of that. So by having most of your crew shoved aft, not only were they causing a constant menace and distraction for the officers by traipsing around above, below, and all around officers' quarters and rooms, but it also meant that if you needed to call action stations, there were crew who had to run almost the entire length of a battlecruiser just to get to their action stations, and whilst the officers could relatively easily get to the bridge, etc., they worked out that actually if you have all the men amidships, they can get to their stations much quicker on average, and there's a lot more of them. And since you will always have at least some officers on duty on the bridge, the fact that it would take the captain or whoever a few minutes extra maybe to get from his quarters all the way up to the bridge if his quarters were back in the stern wasn't the world's biggest tragedy, because whoever was on the bridge, if it was a kind of a snap thing of, oh look, enemies on the horizon, we need to open fire in the next 30 seconds, whoever was on the bridge would be able to handle that, hopefully, and the crew, more importantly, who are firing the guns and etc., would be pretty much at their action stations within that time period. Whereas if you flipped it around, you could actually end up in certain circumstances where you might actually end up under fire before everybody's actually settled into their action stations, which is not good. And so it kind of flipped back on the Queen Mary for those and a few other reasons, but we only have so much time. Appalachian Tiger asks, what effect did Order 227, not one step back, have on the Soviet Navy? To be perfectly honest, not all that much, other than making the sailors and marines of the Soviet naval forces probably fairly grateful they weren't in the Red Army. And that's for the simple reason, well, one, Order 227 was issued to the Red Army, not the Navy, so they were basically immune to it. And also, by the time it was issued, the Soviet Navy, well, at least in the Baltic, had pretty much been blockaded into its ports, so it was physically impossible for them to go any further back, even if they wanted to, because, well, they'd run out of sea. Unless, of course, they equipped gigantic tracks or legs to their ships and walked to them over land, which, as Supreme Commander has taught us, is apparently a thing. And to be honest, if there was any nation that was going to equip destroyers and cruisers and battleships with tracks or giant mechanical spider legs and send them walking forwards as land-based behemoths of destruction, it probably would have been the Soviets. But they didn't, so yeah, there wasn't elsewhere for them to go. And pretty much the similar situation in the Black Sea. They had a little bit more freedom of operation there, but not an awful lot more. And over up in the wastes of the Arctic, well, there were plenty of German aircraft based out of Norway, but they were never at risk of being bottled into their ports up in places like Murmansk anyway. So, yeah, Order 227 was something that happened to other people if you were in the Soviet Navy. Tristan Daly asks, I've noticed that certain British battleships had their catapults removed during the middle of the war. Why was this done? So we talked a little bit about the differences between British and American catapult procedures on their larger ships in the previous Drydock, but specifically for why they were removed, it came down to a few different factors. By the middle of the war, radar had increased its capabilities quite significantly, so that was one aspect. Early war, yes, radar existed, but surface search radar was... put it this way, in medium to rough weather, surface search radar in the first few years of the war had an operational range that was less than the gun range, and thus the optical spotting range, of most battleships. That didn't mean it was useless, because it meant you could still use it in things like nighttime and in poor weather where you couldn't physically see that far. But it did have its limitations, and so visual spotting and spotting by aircraft were still very useful. Also for going out and finding the enemy much, much further away. Spotter aircraft would be quite useful for that as well. However, by the mid to late part of the war, radar's capability had increased quite significantly. So surface search radar and such could see a lot further and a lot more reliably with a lot more detail. You also had the fact that because anti-aircraft batteries and carrier fighters and fighters in general, etc., had all become a fair bit more lethal, a lone spotting aircraft from a battleship was much, much, much more likely to get taken out. And in turn, also, the British at this point were now beginning to show up with a fair number of other potential aircraft sources. They'd lost some carriers, but they had others coming into service. They had a lot of escort carriers coming in both from American and British sources. And with the gradual demolition and, in some cases, withdrawal of entire navies from active combats, like the Italians bowing out in 43, etc., the need to spot with battleship aircraft was lessened, because you could now spot with considerably more and more capable aircraft from a carrier, even if it was a small one. And combined with that, you now were looking at a situation where you needed a lot more air defense. You needed a lot more 20mm and 40mm guns. Because of the advances in radar, you had to now have a lot more radar sets. And bearing in mind, just having radar doesn't just mean, oh, we have a radar, it does everything. You need to have a surface search radar, you need to have an air search radar, you need to have a fire control radar, you need to have an air fire control radar, because they're separate things. You probably end up needing multiple sets of both. There were also some different types of surface search radar. Some were better for long-range spotting of surface targets, others were better for short-range spotting of things like submarine periscopes, and so on and so on and so forth. Plus you had radar systems that told everyone who you were. You had radar systems that were more about electronic warfare detection and jamming. So you look at the electronic suite for a mid to late war battleship, and you'll actually find half a dozen or more different radar systems. So combine all this with the anti-aircraft guns, and suddenly you've got a lot more weight, and as always seems to be mentioned when it comes to these things, a lot of weight high up in the ship. And you need real estate as well to put these guns and things. And with that comes more crew, obviously. Now, on British capital ships, and some of the cruisers, these aircraft hangar facilities, well, the hangar was amidships. It was a fairly big volume, which could be used for, say, crew accommodation. And the cross-deck catapults that they used occupied a fair bit of deck space, which could be filled with anti-aircraft guns. And the aircraft, the catapult systems, etc., they all weighed a fair bit and, again, were relatively high above the waterline. So by removing them, you freed up more weight and more stability for the radar and all the other anti-aircraft guns. So effectively, it was kind of a swap out of we're losing our ability to conduct our own independent long-range aerial reconnaissance and handing that part off to various carriers and maybe some cruisers that retained the aircraft launching facilities. And in exchange, we're going to beef up our own anti-aircraft battery, and we're going to put all the radars on our battleship. So yeah, that's basically the rationale behind it. Admiral Tiberius asks, if the South American naval arms race had continued, i.e. the coming World War I fueled their economic booms, how do you see the build-up going between the three countries? Would the three countries look to America to build their ships, since Britain and Germany were busy? And what ships could have resulted from this continued build-up? So we kind of have a bit of an insight into what they were intending to order, at least in one respect, with the outline designs for the Brazilian battleship Riachuelo, which were tendered for right before the start of World War I. So the designs that were looked into there initially involved 16-inch, but eventually were whittled down to 15-inch ships. And as you can see with this proposal, they're kind of in some ways similar to the Queen Elizabeth's. So they were looking to, as with the Minas Gerais, Rivadavia and Almirante La Torres, the South American countries were definitely looking to try and stay ahead of the curve when it came to naval technology. So buying either the biggest and the best at the time or the equivalent of the biggest and the best if technology was advancing too fast. Now, as you mentioned, if they had continued looking for battleships, then, well, Germany wasn't in any position to build or send them ships, and Britain was a little bit busy acquiring everybody's ships for their own navy. The Argentinians, of course, had already built the Rivadavias with the US yards, although there were some issues with them. Always get your ship built by the lowest bidder somehow does come back to bite you quite often. But nevertheless, once the issues were worked out, the Argentinians were relatively happy with them. The Argentinians almost certainly would have continued because, hey, they've already bought ships from the US. The US is the only major shipbuilding industry out there who isn't immediately occupied. So they may well have placed some kind of order. The Brazilians and Chileans, I'm not necessarily 100% sure. For one thing, most people kind of assumed America was going to get involved in the war at some point anyway, and with that assumption, they may well have then looked at the Almirante La Torres and, well, as far as Brazil was concerned, they'd already sold the Agincourt to the Ottomans, but they might have looked to the general gist of things and gone, yeah, if we order a ship now, given that it's going to take time for us to get the design sorted, get the keel laid, we're not going to see it launched and ready for commissioning for at least 3, maybe 4 years. And in that time, America's probably going to get involved. And when they do, they're probably going to take it over the same as everyone else has taken over everyone else's foreign building battleships. So is it really worth it? Plus, of course, everyone would have been avidly watching World War I, looking at the lessons that are coming out of it, the new ships that were being built as a result of it. And so, with the fact that the Almirante La Torres were obviously in British service, Agincourt was in British service, and there were a lot of other things that were tied up, I don't think the South American countries would have ordered new battleships during World War I, because apart from anything, like say the Chileans, they would want to know, do we need to order replacements for Almirante La Torre and Almirante Cochrane? Is one of them going to get sunk? Are both of them going to get sunk? Are we going to get them back at the end of the war, like the British promised? Or do we just need to go straight on to the next generation, or what? So I think probably what would have happened is that while I can see the Argentinians maybe making an order, the fact that Almirante Latorre physically isn't in Chile means that they're currently kind of the top dogs, so there's no immediate rush. I think they probably would have sat tight, maybe placed some preliminary orders, but I think mainly by the time World War One properly gets going, and bearing in mind, as I said, that they would have all had ships. If Brazil's economic boom had continued, Agincourt would still probably have been one of theirs. They're probably going to watch, see what happens in World War One, take the lessons away, and as soon as it looks like the war is coming to an end, you would have seen a big glut of ship orders coming in from them afterwards, because they're not going to get the orders in during the war. They're going to be a bit gun shy on that. But who they'd order from after the war, well, they're not going to be ordering from Germany, because Germany's just lost and the Allies aren't going to let them build anything. But you probably see a mixture of orders from the UK and the US, and at that point they would have been sitting there going, right, well, according to all the lessons of World War One, this is what we need. At which point you probably actually would have seen pretty fast ships armed probably with 16-inch guns, something like a hybrid between a Colorado and a Queen Elizabeth, I would anticipate. And those would have been flying off the order shelves pretty quickly, and how that would have factored into the Washington Naval Treaty, I don't know. It is, of course, possible that they might all start ordering from the US, but, as I say, apart from the fact they might be a bit gun-shy about the US being the next one to get involved in the war and take those battleships as well, there'd also be the fact that if all three countries are ordering from the US, they'd probably be worried about the other two finding out what the capabilities of their particular ship were. Dominic von Bismarck asks, in the movie U-571 there is a scene that depicts two submarines fighting underwater. I understand how this would work in modern times, but in World War II this seems a little too much like artistic license. How accurate is that scene? And can a single torpedo actually sink a destroyer as shown by the film, or is this once again a case of artistic license? So, whilst I haven't actually seen the movie in question for a very long time, generally speaking, any kind of idea of submarines fighting other submarines underwater in World War II is, no. It kind of happened on a couple of occasions, but that was with very shallow running submarines and very much in a one stalking the other situation. The kind of idea of any active, yes, we are both hunting and fighting each other underwater, no, that's not realistic for World War II. The sensor technology and the torpedoes just aren't there. If it was a case of, well, we're underwater and we can see this other submarine travelling on the surface, that actually did happen quite often. But, yeah, not an underwater duel. Now, as far as the second part of your question goes with destroyers being sunk by a single torpedo, that is actually relatively realistic. Destroyers are a bit of an odd one, in that you have destroyers that survive the weirdest and you'd think the most ridiculous situation. So HMS Eskimo famously loses her bow repeatedly, gets it put back on. You have HMS Zubian in the previous war, which was two World War I destroyers, HMS Zulu, HMS Nubian. One had its bow blown off, one had its stern blown off. The respective alternate sections survived, were welded back together to create a new destroyer. You had the USS Shaw at Pearl Harbor, had its entire bow blown off by a full-on magazine explosion, yet the midships and aft parts stayed intact and were eventually repaired. But at the same time, you also have destroyers usually taking hits amidships, which either are just powerful enough in and of themselves or set off something like the torpedoes or some magazine, or they breach a major portion of the machinery spaces and cause structural failure that can just send a destroyer straight to the bottom with a single hit. So that, and also, I mean, it can be a case of you take a hit, the ship explodes, there's two halves of the ship, they very rapidly sink, that's the end of it. I mean, it can also be you get your bow stern blown off, and it's not quite as durable as some other ships, and you just go down that way. But you can also be in situations where you hit a mine, you get hit by a shell, you get hit by a torpedo, get hit by a bomb, whatever. The ship is fatally damaged, but it takes a fair while to actually do the sinking part, even though the damage itself can't be recovered. So, yeah, a destroyer being hit by a single torpedo and being sunk as a result of it, that's actually pretty realistic. I mean, it's not 100% guarantee, but it happened plenty of times in World War II. So, yeah, that's kind of, it's a 50-50 on realism based on those two scenarios. And that brings us to the end of this week's Drydock. Thank you very much for listening. You may have heard in the background, this Drydock was brought to you by the sounds of Mac the gerbil, who was quite happily chewing on cardboard on the other side of the room during this entire recording session. Hopefully, by relocating the recording area, I've managed to keep far enough away that isn't interfering. But if it is causing any issues, do let me know, and I can try and look at putting up even more soundproofing between me and poor little Mac. Kentucky the gerbil is a much quieter individual normally, and he's a lot closer, as are two harvest mice, who are currently looking at me wondering what all the racket is. But in any case, one other important piece of channel admin. At the time that you're listening to this, if you're listening to it on the regular Sunday release, and in 24 hours, if you're listening to this on the Patreon release earlier, I will be in Stockholm on Monday, Monday the 16th, barring, as of the time of recording, any last-minute changes in the 24 to 48 hours before the flight is due to leave. The flights that I was originally supposed to be on were cancelled, but I was offered rebooking, so the current flight itinerary is that I'm going to be heading out on Sunday afternoon, well, immediately after lunch, to be perfectly honest, on Sunday. I will then arrive in Stockholm on Sunday evening, and I will find myself a place to eat and find a place to bed down. Well, I know where I'm bedding down, actually, so that part's sorted. Then on Monday, I will be filming and interviewing in the Vasa Museum. Obviously, it's currently closed to the public, but I am able to film in there by prearranged appointment, so unfortunately you won't be able to meet me in there. But once I'm done at the end of the day, I will be looking for somewhere to eat and somewhere to meet people if they so choose. I understand, obviously, there's all sorts of situations, lockdowns, partial lockdowns, advice, etc. going on, so be that as it may. But if you do fancy saying hi at an appropriate social distance, then we can do that on Monday evening. And then on Tuesday, I will be heading back home to the UK. So that is the plan, as they say, barring any last minute changes. The other wonderful thing about the changes to the flights means that the reason I'm going to spend most of Tuesday in the air is because with a direct flight home cancelled, I have to take a hopper flight to Helsinki and then turn around inside 45 minutes, so better hope that first flight takes off on time, to get a plane back to the UK. So it's all going to be fun and games. With all of that said, if the situation has calmed down somewhat by the end of the year, I may be taking a further trip to Stockholm, then Oslo, and then further north, maybe to somewhere like Narvik, just after Christmas, but that remains to be seen, because this is obviously business. That trip would be personal, although with a lot of sightseeing, and whether or not that personal trip goes ahead will obviously depend on what travel restrictions are in place at that time. So now you're all thoroughly bored of listening to what I'm going to be doing in Sweden for a couple of days. If you reach this far, thank you very much for listening. If you do want to meet in Stockholm, drop me a quick line on email or Discord, and I'll try and keep you appraised of the itinerary. And I shall see you all again in another video. Thank you very much. Bye.